Welcome to the Modern Mexico Podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Parish. On today's episode of the podcast, we're talking about security dynamics in the state of Chiapas and how Chiapas represents some of the broader challenges that Mexico faces when it comes to reducing violence and curbing the power of organized crime groups. Chiapas, a state in southern Mexico, is known for its remote indigenous communities and for producing most of Mexico's organic coffee. Recent events in Chiapas raise questions about what the government can do as powerful organized crime groups move into the state and local criminals adopt increasingly violent tactics. Chiapas has been in the news recently after President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum was stopped by masked men during a campaign trip through southern Mexico. Al Jazeera English covered the incident.
A tense interaction in Mexico's Chiapas state. While on the campaign trail, Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's leading presidential candidate, was stopped by masked men believed to be linked to the Sinaloa cartel. They requested government intervention to put an end to the violence plaguing southern Mexico. Mexico's Chiapas state, which borders Guatemala and Belize, has seen violence spiral as the rival Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels wage a war for territory. In Mexican states like Chiapas, the spillover from violence has led to the internal displacement of thousands of people.
We've seen a number of high-profile incidents, including battles involving heavily armed gunmen from the Sinaloa cartel and the New Generation Jalisco cartel, as well as local-level disputes involving smaller criminal groups. France 24 recently covered an incident where a convoy of trucks carrying gunmen from the Sinaloa cartel were welcomed by cheering residents who believed that the heavily armed cartel commandos would help improve their town's security situation.
This part of Chiapas is the heart of a turf war between Mexico's two most powerful cartels. Signs of violence are all around. Buildings scarred by large caliber bullets and abandoned houses. The Sinaloa cartel entered here triumphantly a few weeks ago after dislodging their rivals, Jalisco Nueva Generación. In these images, heavily armed men parade through the streets while locals applaud.
I think that one key factor for understanding Chiapas is geography. Over half of Chiapas' 5.5 million residents live in rural communities. There are only 3 cities in Chiapas that have more than 200,000 residents, but there are more than 20,000 small towns and villages scattered across the state. Chiapas also has one of the highest labor market informality rates of any state in Mexico. 7 out of every 10 residents work off the books in the informal economy. And when you're up in the highlands of Chiapas, there's this incredible feeling of isolation. You're surrounded by mountains, and these small towns really seem so far away from any nearby cities and a world away from the politicians in Mexico City. The scattered distribution of Chiapas' population also plays a role in the state's ability to build up a presence and construct functional institutions. Overall, we know that 98% of all the murders in Chiapas go unsolved. That's one of the worst rates of impunity of any state in Mexico. And Chiapas has for centuries been marked by this dynamic of limited government capacity in rural stretches of the state. But over the last several years, many small towns in Chiapas have been marked by new types of violence from criminal groups. On today's episode of the podcast, we're speaking with Ioan Grillo, one of the top journalists covering the topic of organized crime in Mexico. Hi, Ioan. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, great to be here, Nate. Good to be here on the podcast with you.
So, for the first question, I wanted to ask, what 3 words would you pick to describe the current security dynamic in Chiapas?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would use the words uh, first the word oppressive, and I would say oppressive because I went reporting there into these areas like Frontera como Lapa, which is controlled by the Jalisco New Generation cartel and a civilian wing of theirs known as Mais. And when we went to talk to a pastor there in this town, and one of the first things he said was, "We've been invaded." It was this idea of kind of control, this almost like a foreign, an outside force inside controlling you there. And he was worried, even what he'd said in the services, in his church services, if spies of the cartel could be there listening to what he was saying and informing on him. With their checkpoints going into many of these places with people with machetes, the kind of first line, but often people with guns very close to them, open what they called offices of the cartel, kind of knew where they were, so a real presence. And then the real, bottom line is this, demanding money from people, extortion, and that's what really hurts people. You're working hard, you're just above the breadline for many of these people, and then you have to pay this extortion payment to the cartel. He told a story, about this one person who was involved in protests against the cartel violence, and they were framed as being, fairly, not really naming the cartel. They were framed as being protests for peace. And this guy in a nearby town, and was then they went into his house and held him up and tied him up and beat him in front of his family and then shot him. And those kind of things words are going around of those type of incidents. Second word I would use is fractured, and fractured I think is this phenomenon of the cartels, of organized crime in Mexico, of this what we used to call a kind of drug war in Mexico. I now use more the word cartel war, because it's a very weird hybrid conflict of these organized crime groups. But the many different groups, many different people. I mean, you have these big forces of the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel, but then you also have various allies of them and these different groups with different names. Some groups which could be self-defense forces, but you're not really sure. Are they narcos? Are they self-defense forces? Are they some kind of genuine, indigenous groups trying to fight for kind of self-rule, or something more allied to kind of darker organized crime thing? So, like in many of these places with the kind of worst violence, most chaos now, is many different groups in different places, a very fractured environment. And then the third word I would use is worsening. This has been a clearly downhill trajectory here. We for a long time Chiapas was seen as somewhere a bit immune to the violence. You had a violence with Sinaloa, violence was Guerrero, violence was Michoacan. Uh, Chiapas was more the Mayan pyramids of Palenque, San Cristobal, going for to this nice folkloric city, and the Zapatista rising was kind of peaceful uprising. But now it's definitely got very, very many incidents of these dark things happening that you see around Mexico. People kept inside their homes with gunfights going off, um, big massacres, major kidnappings, and then you see things. Just very recently, the last month, the whole town. People running, fleeing, refugees from a whole town to a worsening situation, and is worrying where this could lead.
Okay, so oppressive, fractured, and worsening. I think those are three very helpful words, and also they're a little bit negative about the outlook for Chiapas. And I know that a lot of the news reports that I see from Chiapas right now are really alarming. For instance, a few weeks ago, President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum's motorcade was stopped by masked men in Chiapas. And I know that overall, the World Justice Project ranks Mexico as one of the world's worst countries in terms of rule of law. And even within Mexico, Chiapas stands out as one of the worst states for rule of law. And I know that you recently did a reporting trip to Chiapas, and I wanted to ask, What's the most interesting thing that you learned while visiting the town of San Juan Chamula?
Yeah, sure thing. So, uh, I mean, like you say, Chiapas is now a bad spot within the broader big problems of Mexico. And in Chiapas, there's different parts of the state with different issues. The kind of worst area is by the border with Guatemala, and then you have different parts. There's a town called San Juan Chamula, which is right next to San Cristobal. It's a very interesting town, and I've been there a few times over the years, but I hadn't been for a while. And on this new trip, I kind of saw quite a changed town. So San Juan Chamula is an indigenous town which has always been very proud of its traditions and kept foreign incursions at bay for many years, kind of been able to create its own leadership, its own kind of indigenous leadership, but not with the Zapatistas, but with their own traditions. They have their own version, kind of own chapter of the Catholic Church there for a long time. They even have their own kind of version of like they'll take OXO stores and they'll kind of change them and have their own kind of weird version, kind of taking the logo and having their own things there and selling their local drink posh, this liquor. Um, some things I learned from this latest trip. One I saw compared to going there 20 years ago when I went there, it certainly got a lot wealthier as a community. It's I saw quite a lot of deep poverty there, particularly like going there 2 decades ago, and a lot of kind of real ramshackle, bad houses. So a lot of quite clear improvement in this area of San Juan Chamula. Now, part of that improvement is connected to the rise of what some of the law enforcement have called and the media have called the Cartel de San Juan Chamula, others more like the Cartel de Chamula, the Chamula Cartel, or different variations of this. And they see San Juan Chamula as being a big center of organized crime in this part of the state, in for a couple of different or several different things. One is there's a lot of human smuggling through Chiapas, people who are on their way northward, and the Chamula cartel is going to be very involved in this segment. Another is in drug selling, local drug selling, and now the Chamula cartel or the Chamula population also spreads very much into San Cristobal de las Casas. It's an interesting phenomenon that a lot of them were actually you had over various decades this strong local Catholic church run by the people of Chamula, and expulsions of people they called evangelicals. They said they were like betraying the religion. They were evangelicals, and they would go and settle these kind of slum areas in San Cristobal. Now you've got almost like a continuous larger community of Chamulan people in San Juan Chamula and in San Cristobal, and they've grown to a big population in these areas, and a lot of drug selling, a lot of local drug selling, control of a local drug trade, and by these kind of various Chamulan mafia figures in San Cristobal. As well as that, you also have this big racket of um, having informal market stalls. So you go on the street and there's like a blanket with a bunch of things being sold, and they're all paying these market leaders, and that's a big organized crime activity as well. Now, one surprising thing, and I haven't seen this really covered elsewhere, is with this kind of merging of the kind of Chamulan organized crime flowing from San Juan Chamula itself into San Cristobal. I've actually saw the emergence of some evangelical churches inside San Juan Chamula itself, which I hadn't seen before. And it's kind of interesting. There's a bit of a mix between the kind of narco culture and some of these evangelical churches. And one of these um, evangelical pastors I talked to was kind of had this narco music playing and a bunch of kind of crazy gold teeth and dressed in a very kind of narco look. But I don't want to say that all of these evangelicals, there's obviously a lot of very deep believing evangelicals there. But managing now to sort of several and photograph several um, quite big evangelical churches within San Juan Chamula, which wasn't possible in the past. So quite a lot of interesting, changing kind of dynamics at this local level, but with some quite bigger repercussions.
So I really enjoyed your reporting on the dynamic in San Juan Chamula, and I think overall it's such a fascinating and unique place. And the church there, which is a brightly painted building where locals blend Catholic and indigenous religious rituals, is one of the coolest places I've ever visited in Mexico. You walk in and there's pine needles all over the floor and candles, and the air is a little bit smoky, and just the whole vibe inside the church is definitely one of the most unique things that I have seen in Mexico. And in my book, I wrote about a coffee growing family who lived in a town called Pantelo, which is not too far from San Juan Chamula. And this family was trying to build a successful business exporting coffee, but was being threatened by local caciques, who are political power brokers who act kind of like organized crime bosses. And the family saw their workers threatened, and actually, the day before I arrived to stay with them for a week or two, they were attacked by gunmen on the way back from their coffee fields. And one foggy night, I rode in their car with them up from San Cristobal, up this steep, winding mountain road back to the town of Pantalo. And they were absolutely terrified that we would be ambushed by paramilitary criminal gunmen along the way. And it was honestly probably one of the most stressful experiences that I've had doing field work in Mexico. And I know you said Chiapas in the past had a reputation for being one of the safer states in Mexico. And for me, that was kind of surprising to see, in 2015, 2016, see some dynamics in Chiapas that seemed a lot more like the things that I had seen in Guerrero and Michoacan and other states in Mexico that were more known for organized crime and violence. And with this family that I wrote about, in the end, like thousands of other residents in Chiapas, they ended up deciding to flee their hometown and abandon their coffee growing land. And I think that they simply gave up trying to get help from police or prosecutors, and they decided that they didn't want to use violence or carry guns to protect their land. They just wanted to run a business. And I know that over the past few years, the dynamic in Pantalo has gotten even worse. And in the last couple of years, an armed self-defense group has emerged in the town, and they are now battling a rival group of organized crime affiliated gunmen. And I took a look through the news just in the last few weeks, and on June 11th, four gunmen were arrested in Pantalo. On May 30th, four men were shot and killed in Pantalo. And on May 20th, an entire family of coffee growers was shot and killed in Pantalo. And a little bit earlier this year, in April, several hundred residents, including most of the town's public school teachers, fled Pantalo in a caravan of 45 vehicles in order to escape from the ongoing violent clashes between the local armed groups. And going back to 2021, there was one very high profile incident where masked criminal gunmen ambushed a patrol of soldiers and state police officers in Pantalo. And there are videos on YouTube that show gunmen in Pantalo wearing black ski masks, running down the road, firing at the convoy of soldiers and police officers. The violence in Pantalo is now so bad that Mexico's election oversight body decided not to set up any voting stations in the town during the 2024 presidential election. So, looking at the dynamic that we see taking place in some of these smaller towns and the caciques that we see, I wanted to ask if you think that the dynamic that we see at the local level in many parts in Chiapas fits with the framework that you develop in your book, Gangster Warlords.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, and just talking about the caciques and Pantolon, a lot of this situation, I think it's been this kind of fusion of violence you see in Chiapas. So you had these older problems of um, political cacique, which could be kind of called chieftain, that word of these kind of bosses that would use violence and corruption to stay in power, these kind of strong men in these communities. And then that then fuses with the bigger phenomenon of cartels, organized crime, drug trafficking. And so that's what becomes very explosive in Chiapas and in many of these places. And so it really starts to be like a kind of civil conflict, resembling a civil conflict, as well, kind of intertwined with these same groups that are smuggling people, smuggling drugs, smuggling weapons, and so forth. So my book, Gangster Warlords, was published in 2016 and developed on a lot of what I was seeing over a lot of years in covering Latin America. Was this bigger phenomenon of why is it that organized paramilitary organized crime, to use a kind of word for it, a phrase for it, was spreading so much in Latin America, with these different expressions. So in Mexico, we talk about cartels, but in Central America, you talk more about gangs, pandillas. In Brazil, you have what they call commandos, in the favelas. In Jamaica, you have posses. In Colombia, also cartels. In Ecuador, in Haiti, these gangs. So you have these kind of very large organized crime groups, which are not only trafficking drugs, trafficking guns, trafficking people, but also becoming like political players, paramilitary forces, and also kind of cultural forces, almost like rock stars sometimes. If we look at the cultural force of Chapo Guzman and Narcos, all of these things. And that's the same in other countries like Brazil with favela funk music and these different things. So I was thinking that in across Latin America, you have this kind of historical circumstances where in a certain moment you had the Cold War dynamics in the 20th century. And you had these kind of clashes between more conservative military dictatorships, left-wing guerrilla groups. These various things bring out these clashes. And you still have some of that lingering on, but the bigger dynamic has changed. So now the bigger violence of these armed groups, and if you look in Mexico, which had some guerrilla groups in the 20th century in Mexico, like in Guerrero, the Party of the Poor of Luis Cabañas, but the guerrilla groups are generally more controlled, and now the narcos, the cartels have been, way bigger than any of these guerrilla groups, and a genuine threat um, to government in terms of things like the Culecanazo, where you have in Sinaloa 700 to 800 gunmen facing off against the Mexican army, and also the law enforcement, the security forces sometimes working with cartels, and you see that in Chiapas as well. So in Chiapas, I think we see very much these dynamics. It's kind of one of the reasons I think that a lot of these places that for a time seem immune to this will suddenly get this and explode. And so we have, this year, these same phenomena in Chiapas, in Ecuador, in Haiti, a lot of the big stories in Latin America and the Caribbean, right now and for recent years have been involved with these major organized crime groups. And we see that in Chiapas going way beyond what regular drug trafficking, regular organized crime to being this civil conflict, and that gets very, very hard to solve.
So I think you made some great points there. It seems like in the world of organized crime, especially at the local level and in some states like Chiapas, some of the dynamics that we're seeing are new or continually evolving, but some of the overall patterns have been established at the local level for a very long time. And I know that Chiapas has for centuries been a state where the federal government in Mexico City has really struggled to exert control. And as you mentioned, over the last 30 years, many small towns were controlled by the Zapatista rebel army, and they kind of established their own autonomous fiefdoms in the state. And I think that this dynamic of weak federal government with limited capacity and the existence of local strongmen has existed for a long time in Chiapas. But in the last few years, this nexus or synergy between local political bosses and bigger organized crime groups seems to have really become more pervasive. And in 2023, the Zapatista army actually announced that they would cancel many of their activities and operations due to ongoing threats from organized crime in the state of Chiapas. And it does seem like the security situation in Chiapas has deteriorated over the last few years. So I want to ask, what grade would you give President Lopez Obrador for his security policies in Chiapas?
But then getting on to what you're saying, what's the grade of López Obrador in Chiapas? I'm going to give a bit more of a general grade on his security policy. I think Chiapas kind of, in some ways, I don't think he's not focused on a single Chiapas security policy. It's more of a national security policy that Chiapas fits into. But I'll give it a D. Um, I think on AMLO's government, I think AMLO's government is a mixed bag, and I'll get to a deeper debate about AMLO. I think it's a mixed bag, and he has positive aspects on raising the minimum wage and on social programs and some other things. And obviously, he's popular, and his chosen successor has won the election massively. However, in security, I think it's a failed policy. I also think Peña Nieto was a failed policy on security and Calderon. But we're talking about AMLO right now, so I'll give it a D. I think, I mean, you have the idea of hugs, not bullets, which a lot of people will hold up, abrazos, no balazos, and will deride. I think in some ways that was a slogan. It was kind of a notion. They didn't really have anybody there to turn that into real programs. So I do believe that social programs, you could say hug not bullets means, we need social programs. We need to work with poor people so they don't become cartel people. We need to work in these communities. It didn't really come very concretely, turn into very concrete things. And you have things like a program of scholarships for high school kids. They called that as well becarios, no sicarios, like scholars, not sicarios. But that doesn't really work in terms of crime prevention, because often the kids who are in high school and getting good grades and getting those scholarships are not the kids who are joining the cartels. On the other side of López Obrador's security policy was this National Guard. These are quite, you could say, it's quite contradictory ideas. You have the idea of one idea of hugs not bullets, the other idea of actually more strength in the military. You boost the National Guard, which then becomes under military control, is effectively really an extension of the military. Now, this is complicated, and in some ways, López Obrador under his government was legalizing what the previous two governments had done anyway, which was keep the military on the streets in a massive way in law enforcement capabilities. The thing about the National Guard was it didn't, as well as having a growth of National Guard, it maybe acted as a kind of way of containment against, in some areas we have a bunch, big military base, and you have some containment against the movement of cartels there. It wasn't really a strategy of how you do that, and often you have a base, and just quite close to it, these cartels will continue growing, as well as you have the issue of corruption. So certainly in Chiapas, I mean, occasionally you have these big shootouts happening. Like I say, Comalapa is a big area. Comalapa, and then a place called Chamik close to it. There were big back and forth, crazy fights happening between these two areas. Then the National Guard would go in and they kind of calm down for a bit. Then the National Guard might leave again. They keep on at it, fighting again. So So not really a strategy there, and we've seen over the whole period of of Mexico, maybe the argument is that kind of violence has stabilized, maybe slightly decreased overall. There's a lot of questions about some of those numbers of murder victims, but it's certainly no marked improvement, and a perception by many people in many parts of the country of things getting worse. Certainly in Chiapas, like I argue, it's a worsening. So yeah, it's been bad, and we have to look to the future for improved things there.
Okay, so you said in general you would give Lopez Obrador a D for his security strategy. And I think specifically when we look at Chiapas, it's tough to give Lopez Obrador anything higher than a D. Many security analysts might give him an F. Many might agree with a D rating, but it's hard to give him a more ruddy assessment than that. Overall, I think that in some ways, Chiapas is a great state to study because it almost seems like a petri dish where we can see the results of many of Lopez Obrador's flagship policies being carried out. And I think for me, my big takeaway is that soldiers and social programs are not enough to improve security. And this combination of soldiers and social programs has simply not worked out well in Chiapas. And we know that Chiapas is the most militarized state in Mexico, but the heavy presence of soldiers and the National Guard has not prevented this deterioration in the overall security dynamic. And we also know that almost all of the murders that occur in Chiapas go unsolved. So I do think that many residents in Chiapas have benefited from Lopez Obrador's social programs, and we know that he sent in extra National Guard patrols to help gird Chiapas's border with Guatemala. But overall, we do see this incursion of powerful organized crime groups and a significant deterioration in the security dynamic in many small mountain towns in the States. And I think that many local gunmen in Chiapas are learning to emulate the tactics that criminals are using in other parts of the country, and that they're learning new ways to leverage and profit from violence and intimidation. And according to the Global Organized Crime Index, Mexico is now considered to be the world's worst hotspot for extortion. And I think that overall, Lopez Obrador has mostly chosen to deny or downplay the severity of the security problems in Mexico in general, and also in Chiapas specifically. And with that in mind, I want to ask, what's one policy recommendation that you think Mexico's newly elected president, Claudia Sheinbaum, needs to implement in order to improve the security dynamic in Chiapas?
Yeah, sure. So now we have a new president, Claudia Sheinbaum. I want to hope for success, like with any new president coming in. There's so many deep problems in Mexico, but also be wary, and cover this presidency with a critical eye, like all of them. I think when people look at like policies, it's easy to look for things to say, point to things which sound good, and which instinctively are good in the long term, but are very, very, very hard to do. Like say there should be no impunity, or way less impunity. Now, obviously, that would be great, but really building a justice system in Mexico that functions and can reduce that in the long term is such a massive task. And when you say like almost like no murders are solved, to get from that to like 50% or 60% or 70% of murders solved is such a high thing, especially when you have like 500,000 unsolved murders sitting there. Um, to say that there some of these bigger things, or there should be, we end the war on drugs. I'd be often been in favor of drug policy reform, and I continue to be in favor of drug policy reform, but unfortunately there's not a single button you can press to stop these kind of violence now. This is a hard process. So I would say, if I may, you ask for one policy, I'm going to say three things which I think are try to be kind of realistic, things that they could do to try and improve the situation somewhat, try and get Mexico on a path where things are getting better rather than just getting worse. So one is to hit the most violent criminals. I mean, you have to prioritize when you have 30,000 murders a year, all of the other crimes going on. You can't go after everything at once. So you need law enforcement to prioritize. So I would say, not just this idea of going after the biggest kingpins, but look at like where are the most murders happening, which groups and which individual, sometimes commanders, because you have these like commanders and squads of killers, go after them. Try and keep repeatedly go after the most violent criminals to try and have these organizations say, well, if we really are really violent, then they're going to go after us more. So we're better off trying to be less violent in our behavior. That's the first hope and one thing. The second thing, and you mentioned this extortion, there needs to be a national anti-extortion campaign. And maybe this has to be kind of in a way of saying, creating kind of extortion-free zones, saying, okay, in the center of San Cristobal, no one's paying extortion, and then expand this. And you're going to get local people behind you. You're going to get businesses behind you, and it's good for the economy. So a really big public anti-extortion campaign. And the third thing is, we talked about hugs not bullets failing, but have real prevention programs. Make them long term. Have real programs of going in there into these communities, into these neighborhoods, and saying, okay, these are the people who are being recruited by the cartels, having good social workers and looking for ways. And that's just ways to hope to try and turn this around. But it can be easier to say these things, and I don't know if the government is ever listening at all, than actually doing these. But still hoping at some point this security situation in Mexico, which has been bad for like 17 years, you'd hope at some point it would have to improve.
So you mentioned hitting the most violent criminals and going after extortion. And I think in particular, those are two, great policy ideas for the Scheinbaum administration. Um, but you also mentioned the idea of impunity. And something that is really interesting to me is that Mexico City is sometimes seen as a success story when it comes to improving security. And some of the things that Mexico City has done are using a heavy police presence to deter crime. And I think that could be more difficult in Chiapas. I know that Chiapas has only around 2,000 state police officers. And in contrast, Mexico City has around 90,000 state police officers. But it's really important to know that even in Mexico City, impunity levels are really, really high. In 2021, nearly 99% of all the murders in Mexico City were never solved. So the Mexico City model seems to be more about deterrence than investigating and arresting criminals. And I think that right now we still have to wait and see what type of strategy Scheinbaum and her team will try and implement in Chiapas. But when I think about the endless expanse of green hills in Chiapas and the thousands of small towns in the state, it seems like there's no way that the existing police forces in Chiapas are going to be able to effectively patrol so many isolated towns and have a real impact in deterring crime. And I think more generally in Mexico, we're seeing a variety of types of violent crime, including extortion, carjacking, and cargo truck hijacking. And President-elect Sheinbaum has said that she wants to increase the number of National Guard patrolmen in Mexico, and she also wants to improve Mexico's investigative capacity. But as president, she's going to have to turn talking points into tactics. And we still have to wait for some more concrete details about the plans and policies that she's going to implement. But it does seem like there's a pressing need in Chiapas and in many other parts of Mexico to reduce impunity and to increase the capacity of the local police. And overall, the number that really stands out to me is the rate of impunity for murder. Right now in Chiapas, the police are only managing to solve around 1 out of every 100 murders in the state. So again, for me, the big takeaway is that social programs and soldiers are not a sufficient strategy for tackling the violence in Chiapas. And it just seems like it's going to be impossible to really improve the security dynamic in Mexico unless the new president takes the initiative to make a massive multi-billion-dollar investment in improving the capacity of Mexico's police and prosecutors. And in any case, it's super interesting to hear your perspective. I want to encourage listeners to check out your book, Gangster Warlords. And overall, I just want to say thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Great to be here, Nate. Great to talk to you.
I wanted to take a short break to remind listeners that the Modern Mexico podcast is sponsored by República Coffee Roasters. Mexico is known for producing some of the best coffee in Latin America. In Mexico City, one of the best places residents and visitors can buy coffee is the República Coffee Roasters Cafe in Colonia Roma. República Roasters coffee is also available for purchase online. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Modern Mexico podcast. If you like what you heard in the podcast today, check out my book, Searching for Modern Mexico, which is available on Amazon. The next episode of the podcast is coming soon. Until then, hasta luego, amigos.